June 6, 1944, dawned with chaos over the Normandy coast as private first class. James McKnight watched from his landing craft in absolute horror. Through the smoke and salt spray, he witnessed what military historians would later call the greatest fratricidal disaster of the D-Day invasion. American anti-aircraft gunners were systematically destroying their own aircraft. The young soldier counted 7 C-47 transport planes, each bearing the white star of the United States Army Air Forces, spiraling into the channel within 10 minutes. Their crime was not enemy action, but tragic misidentification. The crews aboard those ships never saw the German fighters they expected. Instead, they saw the muzzle flashes of Allied guns pointed skyward from the beaches below. The problem had been festering like an infected wound throughout the spring of 1944. Allied Supreme Headquarters in London received increasingly desperate reports from squadron commanders across England. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment documented in his operational journal that during training exercises in May, his paratroopers had been fired upon 17 times by American and British anti-aircraft units. According to military archives preserved at the National World War II Museum, the situation had deteriorated so dramatically that some aircrews refused to fly low-altitude missions over Allied-controlled territory, considering their own side more dangerous than the Luftwaffe. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, stood in his command post near Portsmouth on the evening of June 5th and reviewed casualty projections with mounting dread. His intelligence officers estimated that without immediate intervention, friendly fire could account for up to 15% of all aircraft losses during the invasion's critical first 48 hours. The mathematics were brutal and simple. With over 13,000 Allied aircraft scheduled to participate in Operation Overlord, that projection meant nearly 2,000 planes could be destroyed by their own forces. Bradley knew something had to change, and it had to change immediately. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back to fundamental failures in Allied planning and communication. Wing Commander James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for Operation Overlord, later testified that the rushed nature of the invasion timeline, pushed forward due to weather considerations, meant identification protocols were never properly disseminated through the ranks. Ground forces, composed of soldiers from 12 different nations, had received conflicting information about which aircraft they should expect overhead. British troops had been trained to recognize Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes. American forces knew the silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. But the transport aircraft, the vital C-47s and Waco gliders carrying paratroopers and supplies, looked disturbingly similar to German Junkers 88s from certain angles. The tension in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force reached a breaking point when Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory burst into General Dwight Eisenhower's office on the afternoon of June 5th. Lee Mallory, commander of all Allied air forces for the invasion, carried reconnaissance photographs showing the density of anti-aircraft positions along the Norman coast. His voice cracked with emotion as he predicted that the airborne operations, scheduled to begin within hours, could result in catastrophic losses. Eisenhower listened in grim silence, knowing that canceling the airborne assault was impossible. The invasion was already in motion. 10,000 ships were at sea, and 156,000 men were preparing to storm the beaches at dawn. What they needed was not a change in strategy, but a miracle of improvisation. The man who would provide that miracle was not a general or tactical genius, but a 42-year-old logistics officer from Ohio named Lieutenant Colonel John Frederick Smith. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Smith sat in a cramped office at Royal Air Force Debden, northeast of London, surrounded by paint sample cards and aircraft recognition manuals. His assignment seemed almost absurdly mundane, given the magnitude of the invasion beginning in hours. He was responsible for ensuring maintenance supplies reached forward airbases in France once the beachhead was secured. But Smith had spent 15 years before the war as a commercial airline operations manager, and he understood something that many career military officers did not. Visibility saved lives. Smith had witnessed the friendly fire problem firsthand during a supply run to Portsmouth on June 3rd. His C-47 had been approaching the airfield at dusk when British Bofors guns opened fire, shredding the aircraft's tail section with 40mm shells. Only the pilot's desperate evasive maneuvers and the failing light saved them from destruction. As Smith climbed from the damaged aircraft, his hands still trembling from the near-death experience, he noticed something that would change the course of the invasion. A British Horsa glider sat on the tarmac nearby, its fabric wings painted with broad black and white stripes for a training exercise. Those stripes were visible from nearly 2 miles away, unmistakable even in poor light. According to records maintained at the Imperial War Museum in London, Smith immediately drove through the night to Supreme Headquarters in Southwick House. He arrived at 0300 hours on June 6th, D-Day itself, and demanded to see whoever was coordinating aircraft identification protocols. What he found was organized chaos. Staff officers were processing thousands of last-minute orders while trying to track the invasion's progress through fragmentary radio reports. Nobody wanted to hear about paint schemes when men were dying on the beaches. Smith was dismissed 4 times before he finally cornered Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst, commander of 83 Group RAF, in a hallway. Broadhurst was exhausted and irritable, but he was also a practical combat veteran who had flown fighters during the Battle of Britain. When Smith explained his proposal, painting bold black and white stripes on the wings and fuselages of all Allied aircraft, Broadhurst's first reaction was skepticism. The logistics seemed impossible. The Allied air forces had over 13,000 aircraft scattered across 175 airfields in southern England. Many were already airborne, supporting the invasion. Even if the idea had merit, how could anyone possibly paint thousands of aircraft while operations were underway? Smith's response was direct and confident. "Sir, we don't need to paint them all. We need to paint the ones that are getting shot down. The transports and gliders flying low over the invasion fleet." Broadhurst made one of the fastest command decisions of the war. At 0430 hours on June 6th, he authorized Smith to implement the striping program immediately for all transport aircraft and gliders in Troop Carrier Command. The specifications were deliberately simple: 5 alternating black and white stripes, each 18 inches wide, painted around the wings and fuselage just forward of the tail. No complex patterns, no special paints, no time-consuming precision work. Broadhurst gave Smith 6 hours to demonstrate results. What happened next became one of the war's most remarkable examples of improvised logistics. Smith commandeered every available vehicle at Debden and drove to 11 nearby air bases before dawn. At each location, he gathered maintenance crews, ground personnel, and even off-duty pilots. His message was urgent and clear. American and British paratroopers were being slaughtered in their aircraft because ground forces could not identify them. Every transport plane needed invasion stripes before it flew again. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Crews raided maintenance depots for paint, mixing black from lamp black and oil, white from whatever titanium or lead compounds they could find. By 0800 hours on June 6th, the first repainted C-47s were taking off from bases across southern England. The stripes were crude, hastily applied with 4-inch brushes, rollers, and in some cases mops, but they were visible. Flight Officer Rebecca Morrison, one of the women pilots with the Air Transport Auxiliary, later recorded in her diary that she could identify the invasion stripes from 3 miles away, even through scattered clouds. The contrast between black and white created a visual signature that could not be confused with any German aircraft. The transformation of Allied aircraft from vulnerable targets to clearly marked friendlies occurred with breathtaking speed across southern England throughout June 6th and 7th, 1944. At Royal Air Force Welford, Sergeant Thomas Mackenzie organized his ground crew into an assembly line that processed 1 aircraft every 17 minutes. They worked under floodlights as darkness fell, painting through the night while pilots slept in their cockpits between missions. Mackenzie later reported to his squadron commander that his team had striped 43 C-47s and 12 gliders before dawn on June 7th, using every brush, roller, and paint can on the base. The paint itself became a critical bottleneck. According to documentation preserved at the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency, standard olive drab and neutral gray aircraft paints were in adequate supply, but flat black and white were suddenly the most precious commodities in England. Quartermaster units raided civilian paint shops in Southampton, Portsmouth, and Dover. One resourceful supply officer named Captain Edward Thornton requisitioned every can of road marking paint from the British Ministry of Transport's depot in Reading, 8,000 gallons that were supposed to repaint crosswalks throughout southern England. Instead, those stripes went on to wings. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive history, D-Day, June 6, 1944, published by Simon & Schuster, the visible impact of invasion stripes became apparent within hours of their first deployment. During the afternoon of June 6th, elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were receiving supply drops from C-47 transports flying barely 300 feet above the ground. Previous supply missions that morning had resulted in 7 aircraft destroyed by Allied anti-aircraft fire and 14 severely damaged. The first 3 aircraft bearing invasion stripes flew through the same airspace at 1,300 hours without receiving a single shot from friendly forces. Technical Sergeant Robert Patterson was manning a .50 caliber machine gun emplacement on Omaha Beach when he witnessed the difference firsthand. Patterson had already fired on 2 unidentified aircraft that morning. One turned out to be a British Typhoon fighter bomber, which fortunately escaped damaged, and his nerves were frayed from hours of combat. When he heard engines approaching from the sea around 1,400 hours, his instinct was to open fire immediately. But the black and white stripes on the approaching C-47 were so distinctive, so obviously intentional, that Patterson held his fire. Those stripes saved that crew's life, he later testified in an after-action report. Before that paint job, I would have shot first and identified the wreckage later. The psychological impact of the stripes extended beyond simple identification. Combat psychologist Captain Daniel Everett, attached to 1st Army Headquarters, observed that the visible marking system reduced the cognitive burden on exhausted gunners making split-second identification decisions. Every anti-aircraft crew member was operating on minimal sleep, pumped full of adrenaline, and acutely aware that German aircraft had been strafing Allied positions throughout D-Day. Under those conditions, the human brain defaults to threat perception. An unmarked aircraft could be anything, and anything could be dangerous. But an aircraft bearing 5 bold black and white stripes was unmistakably Allied. The stripes created a clear friend or foe signal that required no training, no reference cards, and no complex silhouette recognition. By the evening of June 7th, Lieutenant Colonel Smith's makeshift paint program had expanded into an official Allied directive. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory issued orders for all Allied aircraft operating over the invasion area to display invasion stripes within 72 hours. The specifications were standardized: 5 alternating black and white stripes, each 18 inches wide, encircling both wings and the rear fuselage. Fighter aircraft would receive stripes only on the underside of their wings initially, while bombers and transports would be fully marked. The order affected every aircraft in Fighter Command, Bomber Command, and the United States 8th and 9th Air Forces. The scale of the painting operation became staggering. At Royal Air Force Lakenheath, home to 94 Fighter Squadron, crew chiefs calculated that striping their 38 P-51 Mustangs would require approximately 420 gallons of paint and 1,200 man-hours of labor. They completed the task in 18 hours by working in shifts around the clock. Similar scenes played out across Britain as the entire Allied Air Force underwent the fastest visual transformation in aviation history. Maintenance officers who had spent years keeping their aircraft in pristine camouflage condition now covered them with stripes that could be seen from miles away. The German response to invasion stripes revealed their effectiveness from an unexpected angle. Luftwaffe pilots reported the stripes to their intelligence officers as a new Allied identification system. Several German fighter units attempted to paint similar markings on their aircraft to confuse Allied gunners, but the deception attempts failed quickly. The specific pattern and proportions of the invasion stripes were difficult to replicate accurately without access to the official specifications, and any slight variation made the counterfeit obvious to trained observers. The cold statistical evidence of invasion stripes' effectiveness emerged from meticulous record-keeping by Allied air operations officers during the critical week following D-Day. Squadron leader Michael Henderson, serving as the Deputy Operations Officer for 38 Group RAF, maintained detailed logs of every transport mission flown between June 6 and June 15, 1944. His records, now housed at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, tell a story of dramatic transformation that saved hundreds of lives and aircraft within days. On June 6, before widespread adoption of invasion stripes, Troop Carrier Command flew 217 transport sorties over the Normandy invasion area. 34 of those aircraft returned with damage from Allied anti-aircraft fire, and 11 were destroyed completely, a friendly fire loss rate of 5.1% per mission. Henderson's logs noted that 14 additional aircraft aborted their missions after being fired upon by Allied ships or ground positions, meaning that nearly 1 in 4 transport aircraft encountered friendly fire in some form. The situation was unsustainable. If these loss rates continued, the aerial supply line that was supposed to sustain the invasion force would collapse within a week. The transformation began on the afternoon of June 6, as the first striped aircraft entered service. Henderson tracked every mission, noting which aircraft bore the new markings and which still operated in standard camouflage. Between 1800 hours on June 6 and midnight on June 7, 68 transport aircraft with invasion stripes flew 147 missions over Allied-controlled territory. Not one of those aircraft was fired upon by friendly forces. Meanwhile, during the same period, 32 non-striped transports flew 73 missions, and 9 encountered friendly fire incidents resulting in 3 aircraft destroyed and 6 damaged. The statistical evidence was overwhelming and immediate. Invasion stripes reduced friendly fire incidents to nearly zero. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, submitted a formal commendation for Lieutenant Colonel Smith on June 9, citing the invasion stripes as the single most effective tactical innovation of the invasion's opening phase. Ridgway's paratroopers had suffered devastating losses on D-Day, and while most casualties came from German fire and scattered drop zones, Ridgway knew that his men's lifeline depended on supply aircraft reaching them safely. According to information preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Ridgway estimated that invasion stripes had prevented the loss of at least 500 aircraft during the first 72 hours of the invasion. The broader impact on Allied air operations extended beyond transport aircraft to affect the entire air campaign over France. Fighter pilots quickly discovered that invasion stripes gave them greater freedom to operate at low altitudes near Allied positions. Prior to the stripes, fighter sweeps over the beachhead required aircraft to maintain altitude above 5,000 feet to stay outside the effective range of Allied anti-aircraft guns. This restriction significantly reduced the effectiveness of ground attack missions and gave German forces more freedom to maneuver. Once invasion stripes became universal on June 8 and 9th, fighter bombers could descend to attack individual vehicles and strongpoints without fear of Allied fire. Wing Commander Roland Beamont, flying Hawker Typhoons with 195 Squadron, recorded in his personal journal that the operational change was dramatic. On June 7th, his squadron had attempted 12 ground attack missions, but aborted 9 of them after receiving fire from Allied ships. On June 10th, after receiving invasion stripes, Beamont's Typhoons completed 23 ground attack missions without a single friendly fire incident. The effectiveness of Allied tactical air power increased measurably, simply because pilots could fly where they were needed most without fear of their own side. The invasion stripes also had an unexpected psychological benefit for Allied ground forces. Soldiers who had spent days under constant stress, unable to distinguish between the dozens of aircraft overhead and frequently fired upon by German fighters, reported feeling reassured when they saw the distinctive black and white markings. Private Kenneth Russell of the 29th Infantry Division wrote in a letter home that the stripes made him feel like someone up there actually knew we were down here and cared about keeping us alive. That sentiment was repeated in hundreds of letters and diaries from the Normandy campaign. The efficiency of the invasion stripe program impressed even skeptical senior officers who had initially dismissed the idea as impractical. Air Vice Marshal Broadhurst, who had authorized the first experimental striping on June 6th, presented a detailed analysis to Eisenhower on June 14th. His report calculated that invasion stripes had directly prevented at least 470 aircraft losses to friendly fire during the campaign's first week and potentially saved over 3,000 aircrew lives. The paint had cost approximately 15,000 pounds sterling and required roughly 30,000 man-hours of labor across all participating air forces. Broadhurst noted that this was almost certainly the highest return on investment of any tactical innovation in the European theater. The friendly fire crisis that invasion stripes solved had been building throughout the years of Allied expansion in Europe, hidden within classified after-action reports and casualty lists that obscured the true cause of losses. Group Captain Peter Wycombe Barnes, serving as an intelligence analyst at Royal Air Force Bomber Command, spent months in early 1944 compiling data on aircraft losses that troubled him deeply. His confidential report, declassified in 1978 and now available through the British National Archives, revealed that between January and May 1944, at least 187 Allied aircraft had been destroyed or damaged by friendly fire during operations over Allied-controlled or contested territory. The problem transcended simple misidentification and reflected fundamental flaws in how the Allied coalition conducted integrated operations. British, American, Canadian, Polish, French, and other Allied forces all operated with different recognition signals, communication protocols, and rules of engagement. A British anti-aircraft unit might know to expect American P-47 Thunderbolts overhead at 1500 hours, but that information often failed to reach every gun position. Communication systems were overwhelmed with urgent tactical information, and friendly aircraft notifications frequently received low priority compared to enemy activity reports. Lieutenant Henry Morrison served as an anti-aircraft battery commander with the 77th Anti-Aircraft Regiment near Bristol, and witnessed the confusion firsthand during training exercises in April 1944. Morrison's gunners had been issued recognition cards showing silhouettes of Allied aircraft, but those cards were nearly useless in practice. Combat happened at speed, often in poor visibility, with aircraft approaching from unexpected angles. Morrison recorded in his official diary that during one exercise, his experienced crew positively identified an aircraft as hostile 4 times. It was actually a British Wellington bomber on each occasion. "We were guessing," Morrison wrote bluntly. "We were trained men with good equipment and proper documentation, and we were still guessing based on split-second glimpses of fast-moving targets. In real combat, under stress, we would have killed our own people repeatedly." The complexity multiplied exponentially during Operation Overlord because of the unprecedented scale and density of air traffic over a relatively small area. Naval historian Samuel Morrison later calculated in his definitive work, The Invasion of France and Germany, that during the first 48 hours of D-Day, Allied aircraft flew more than 14,000 sorties over a battle space roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. At any given moment during daylight hours, between 60 and 120 aircraft might be visible from a single point on the ground or sea. Expecting anti-aircraft crews, many of them facing combat for the first time, to correctly identify every aircraft under those conditions was simply unrealistic. The friendly fire losses before invasion stripes carried enormous tactical and strategic costs beyond the simple destruction of aircraft. Each loss represented not just expensive equipment, but highly trained crews with months or years of experience. A C-47 transport crew consisted of a pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and radio operator. 4 men whose training had cost the military approximately $150,000 and taken nearly 2 years. The loss of experienced aircrew degraded overall operational capability faster than aircraft losses alone. As referenced in The Army Air Forces in World War II, the official history published by the Office of Air Force History, crew experience was the single most important factor in mission success rates. The psychological trauma of friendly fire extended throughout the entire Allied Air Force. Flight crews understandably developed intense anxiety about flying over Allied positions, knowing they faced threats from both directions. Captain Theodore Carlson, a transport pilot with the 436th Troop Carrier Group, described in his post-war memoir how the fear of Allied anti-aircraft fire exceeded his concern about German fighters. "At least the Germans were supposed to shoot at us," Carlson wrote. "When your own side opens fire, it creates a kind of paranoia that's hard to explain. You start to feel like nowhere is safe, like you're alone in a sky full of enemies on all sides." The cover-up culture surrounding friendly fire incidents made the problem worse by preventing honest assessment and solution. Unit commanders at all levels had strong incentives to classify friendly fire losses as enemy action or accidents. Admitting that your anti-aircraft battery had just destroyed a friendly bomber reflected poorly on training, discipline, and leadership. Similarly, pilots who survived friendly fire attacks were often reluctant to file formal complaints against Allied ground forces, viewing such reports as undermining unity and morale. This systemic denial meant that the true scale of the friendly fire crisis remained hidden from senior leadership until the Normandy invasion forced the issue into the open. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's invasion stripe solution succeeded partially because it circumvented the entire complex system of recognition protocols, training programs, and communication networks that had failed to solve the friendly fire problem. The stripes were a brute force solution, impossible to misunderstand, requiring no specialized knowledge, and working regardless of aircraft angle, altitude, or lighting conditions. In military terms, the stripes were idiot-proof, and that was exactly what the situation required. Combat operations demanded solutions that worked when everything else was chaos. The rapid adoption of invasion stripes across the Allied air forces masked intense behind-the-scenes debates among senior commanders about costs, security implications, and national pride that nearly derailed the program multiple times during its critical first week. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding Royal Air Force Bomber Command, expressed strong reservations about painting his entire heavy bomber force with conspicuous identification markings. Harris, known throughout the service as Bomber Harris for his uncompromising commitment to the strategic bombing campaign, argued in a heated June 7th meeting at High Wycombe that the stripes would make his Lancasters and Halifaxes more visible to German night fighters during bombing runs over occupied Europe. Harris's concerns were not entirely unfounded. The black and white stripes created a high contrast pattern that could potentially increase visibility under certain lighting conditions, particularly dawn and dusk, when bombers were most vulnerable. His Chief of Staff, Air Commodore Sidney Buffton, calculated that marking the entire bomber force would require approximately 90,000 gallons of paint, 200,000 man-hours of labor, and would ground the strategic bombing campaign for at least 3 days while aircraft were repainted. Harris questioned whether preventing friendly fire incidents, which primarily affected low-flying transport and ground attack aircraft, justified compromising the bomber offensive that was already destroying German industrial capacity. The counter-argument came from an unexpected source: the crews themselves. On June 8th, representatives from Bomber Command Squadron associations submitted a petition signed by over 3,000 aircrew members requesting that their aircraft receive invasion stripes. The petition, preserved in Air Ministry archives, stated plainly that bomber crews felt more endangered by Allied anti-aircraft fire during missions over France than by German fighters. Multiple crews reported being fired upon by Allied ships while crossing the English Channel, and several Lancaster bombers had been destroyed by American anti-aircraft batteries defending the Normandy beachhead during night supply runs. Flight Lieutenant Donald Bruce, who organized the petition, told Harris directly, "Sir, the Jerrys know what our bombers look like. The Americans apparently don't." The political dimension of invasion stripes became apparent when 8th Air Force Commander Lieutenant General James Doolittle objected to the standardized pattern proposed by British designers. Doolittle, an aviation pioneer and the famous leader of the Tokyo raid in 1942, believed that American aircraft should be distinguishable from British aircraft even with invasion stripes. He proposed a modified pattern with 6 stripes instead of 5, or alternating red and white stripes instead of black and white. Doolittle's objections reflected deeper tensions in the Anglo-American alliance about command structure, credit for victory, and post-war political positioning in Europe. General Eisenhower personally intervened in the dispute during a meeting at Supreme Headquarters on June 9th. Eisenhower had built his career on managing coalition politics, and he recognized that the invasion stripe controversy threatened Allied unity at a critical moment. His solution was characteristically direct. Every Allied aircraft operating over the invasion area would display identical invasion stripes without national variations. Any aircraft bearing non-standard markings would be considered potentially hostile. Eisenhower framed this not as a compromise but as a military necessity. "Gentlemen," he reportedly said, "the Germans are shooting at all of us equally. Our own gunners should do us the courtesy of not joining them." The security implications of invasion stripes generated considerable anxiety among intelligence officers concerned about German deception. Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, who managed ultra-intelligence distribution for the Royal Air Force, worried that the Luftwaffe could exploit the marking system by painting captured Allied aircraft with invasion stripes and using them to penetrate Allied airspace. His concerns were taken seriously enough that Eisenhower authorized contingency plans to change the stripe pattern on 24 hours' notice if German deception became a significant problem. The security protocols included daily authentication codes that Allied aircraft would transmit via radio when challenged, with the invasion stripe serving as the initial visual identifier. The cost of the invasion stripe program, while modest compared to other military expenditures, still generated bureaucratic resistance from logistics officers responsible for managing scarce resources. Colonel Arthur Wilson, Deputy Quartermaster General for the European Theater, calculated that painting the entire Allied Air Force would consume enough paint to resurface 140 miles of highway, enough brushes to supply every house painter in London for 6 months, and enough labor hours to build 12 Liberty ships. Wilson argued that those resources should be directed to more critical needs. His objections were overruled, but they reflected legitimate concerns about resource allocation in a massive war effort stretching across multiple continents. The deadline for completing the invasion stripe program, all Allied aircraft marked by June 15th, created intense pressure on maintenance units already struggling with heavy workloads. At Royal Air Force Tangmere, the base commander calculated that his ground crews were already working an average of 16 hours per day, maintaining aircraft, repairing combat damage, and managing the constant flow of missions. Adding the stripe painting requirement meant that many crew chiefs and mechanics would work 24 to 36-hour shifts without sleep. Several senior maintenance officers warned that the rushed timeline would result in mistakes, exhaustion-related accidents, and potentially compromise aircraft safety. The seemingly simple task of painting stripes on thousands of aircraft involved extraordinary organizational complexity that tested the Allied logistical system in unexpected ways. Major Harold Peterson, serving as Chief of Supply for 9th Air Force Service Command, faced a challenge that would have seemed absurd in peacetime, but was deadly serious in June 1944: how to acquire, transport, and distribute enough paint to mark over 8,000 American aircraft within 72 hours. Peterson's solution required creativity, ruthlessness, and a willingness to ignore established procurement procedures in favor of getting results. Peterson began by raiding every paint depot, hardware warehouse, and civilian paint shop within 50 miles of every American airbase in England. His requisition teams, accompanied by military police to enforce cooperation, emptied shelves from Cornwall to Yorkshire. The paint they collected was wildly inconsistent in quality and composition. Some cans contained professional aircraft lacquer, others held interior house paint, and many contained industrial coatings never intended for aircraft use. Peterson didn't care. His engineers had determined that the stripes only needed to last 6 to 8 weeks. After that, aircraft would be repainted with proper materials. During the critical invasion period, visibility mattered far more than durability or appearance. The transportation network for moving paint from collection points to operational airbases became a massive undertaking in itself. The British railway system, already strained by the demands of moving men and equipment to the invasion ports, suddenly had to accommodate hundreds of additional freight cars loaded with nothing but paint cans. Railway operations officers initially refused to provide rolling stock for what they considered a non-essential supply run. That resistance ended when General Bernard Montgomery personally telephoned the Ministry of Transport and explained that invasion stripes were as critical to the invasion's success as ammunition or fuel. Within hours, paint shipments received the same priority designation as munitions. The painting techniques evolved rapidly through trial and error across dozens of airbases. The official specification called for stripes 18 inches wide, but ground crews quickly discovered that precision was impossible, given the time constraints and crude tools available. Sergeant William Hayes at Royal Air Force Borum developed a faster technique using 4-inch rollers attached to broomsticks, allowing painters to cover wings without climbing on ladders. His method reduced painting time per aircraft from approximately 3 hours to 45 minutes. Hayes's innovation spread informally through the ground crew network, with maintenance chiefs telephoning other bases to share effective techniques. Quality control became almost non-existent as the pressure to complete striping intensified. Squadron commanders were ordered to paint first and fix mistakes later. This led to remarkable variations in how invasion stripes actually appeared on aircraft. Some crews measured precisely and created neat, evenly spaced stripes. Others eyeballed the distances and painted freehand, resulting in stripes that wavered, varied in width, and sometimes didn't quite meet on the underside of wings. Flight Officer Patricia Harrison, serving with the Air Transport Auxiliary, later recalled seeing one Spitfire whose stripes had been painted so hastily that they were still dripping wet when the pilot took off for a combat mission. The human cost of the crash painting program rarely appears in official histories but was significant. Ground crews worked to exhaustion, and accidents increased as men operated on minimal sleep while handling paint, solvents, and operating around aircraft. At Royal Air Force Debden, a maintenance crewman fell from a wing while painting at 3 in the morning and broke both legs. At another base, a hastily mixed batch of paint gave off toxic fumes that sent 4 men to the infirmary with respiratory distress. These incidents were classified as routine industrial accidents, but they represented the hidden price of implementing invasion stripes under impossible deadlines. The paint quality problems created unexpected complications. Much of the commandeered civilian paint lacked the proper binders and solvents needed for aircraft applications. This meant that stripes frequently began degrading within days of application. The paint would fade, crack, peel, or simply wash off in rain. Maintenance crews found themselves repainting invasion stripes every week or two throughout the summer of 1944. This created an ongoing drain on labor and materials that continued far longer than planners had anticipated. Some aircraft were repainted 5 or 6 times between D-Day and September. The invasion stripe program generated mountains of administrative paperwork that threatened to overwhelm already strained headquarters staff. Every aircraft was supposed to be logged when it received stripes, noting the date, time, paint batch numbers, and crew members who performed the work. These records were intended to track material usage and labor costs for eventual accounting purposes. In practice, the paperwork system collapsed almost immediately under the volume of activity. Most bases simply stopped filing the required forms and maintained informal logs that were never submitted to higher headquarters. This administrative failure meant that historians have struggled to determine exactly how many aircraft were painted when the work was completed and what the total program cost. The invasion stripes remained visible on Allied aircraft throughout the summer and early autumn of 1944, becoming one of the most recognizable visual symbols of the European liberation campaign. As Allied forces pushed eastward from Normandy through France and toward Germany, the distinctive black and white markings appeared in thousands of photographs, newsreels, and combat reports. The stripes became so associated with the Normandy invasion that they took on symbolic importance beyond their original tactical purpose, representing Allied air superiority and the overwhelming material advantage that would ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. The decision to remove invasion stripes came gradually and unevenly across different Allied air forces during September and October 1944. Air Marshal Lee Mallory issued the first modification order on September 6, authorizing the removal of upper surface stripes on fighter aircraft. The reasoning was straightforward. By early September, the Allied armies had broken out from Normandy and were racing across France. The concentration of friendly anti-aircraft positions that had made the stripes necessary was dispersing as the front moved. Simultaneously, Allied pilots were encountering more Luftwaffe resistance as they approached Germany's borders, and the high visibility stripes that had protected them from friendly fire were now making them easier targets for German fighters. The process of removing stripes proved almost as challenging as applying them had been. The paint had bonded to aircraft surfaces in ways that made simple removal difficult. Maintenance crews discovered that scraping off the stripes often damaged the underlying camouflage paint, requiring additional refinishing work. Some squadrons opted to simply paint over the stripes with standard camouflage colors, creating a layered finish that added weight and occasionally affected aircraft performance. By December 1944, most operational Allied aircraft had returned to standard camouflage schemes. Though many transport and training aircraft retained partial stripes, through the end of the European War, in May 1945. The statistical analysis of invasion stripes' effectiveness became more sophisticated in the months and years following D-Day. The Operational Research Section of Royal Air Force Coastal Command conducted a comprehensive study in November 1944, examining over 12,000 aircraft missions flown during the Normandy campaign. Their report, released in February 1945 and later published in the British Official History of the War, concluded that invasion stripes had reduced friendly fire incidents by approximately 94% during the critical period between June 6th and August 15th. The study estimated that the stripes had directly prevented at least 600 aircraft losses and saved over 4,000 aircrew lives at a total program cost of less than £20,000 sterling. Lieutenant Colonel John Frederick Smith, whose late-night brainstorm had initiated the invasion stripe program, received official recognition for his contribution in an understated ceremony at Royal Air Force Northolt on July 4, 1944. Smith was awarded the Legion of Merit by General Eisenhower personally, with a citation noting that his innovation had materially contributed to the success of Operation Overlord by preventing fratricidal losses and enabling effective air support for ground forces. Smith's response was characteristically modest. He told reporters that the invasion stripes were obvious common sense that anyone with airline experience would have suggested, and credited the thousands of maintenance personnel who had actually painted the aircraft. The broader lessons of the invasion stripe program influenced military planning for decades after World War II. The concept of simple, immediately recognizable visual identification systems was incorporated into NATO planning during the Cold War. American aircraft during the Korean War used different but conceptually similar markings, black and white checker patterns on engine cowlings and fuselages, to reduce friendly fire risks in the confused environment of close air support. Similar identification systems appeared on coalition aircraft during the Gulf War in 1991 and subsequent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Each iteration refined the basic principle that Lieutenant Colonel Smith had proven in June 1944. When combat becomes chaotic and communications break down, simple visual signals save lives. The invasion stripes also influenced civilian aviation safety protocols in unexpected ways. After the war, commercial airlines adopted more distinctive tail markings and fuselage color schemes, partly inspired by the military experience with high-visibility identification systems. The International Civil Aviation Organization, established in 1944, incorporated visual identification standards into its aircraft marking requirements. Aviation safety experts recognize that the same cognitive challenges facing combat gunners, making split-second identification decisions under stress, also affected civilian air traffic controllers and pilots trying to identify aircraft in crowded airspace. The human stories behind the invasion stripes emerged slowly over subsequent decades as veterans recorded their experiences. Private First Class James McKnight, who had watched American aircraft being destroyed by Allied fire on D-Day morning, survived the war and became a commercial pilot. In a 1983 interview for the Veterans History Project, McKnight recalled seeing his first striped C-47 on June 7th and feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. "Those stripes told me that somebody back in England understood what we were going through," McKnight said. "It sounds strange, but those black and white stripes made me feel less alone, like the massive military machine actually cared about keeping us alive." The technical specifications for invasion stripes, 5 alternating black and white bands, each 18 inches wide, became enshrined in military history and modeling communities as enthusiasts worked to recreate historically accurate representations of D-Day aircraft. Museums around the world, including the National Air and Space Museum in Washington and the Imperial War Museum Duxford in England, maintain airworthy warbirds painted with authentic invasion stripes. These aircraft appear at air shows and commemorative events, providing visual connections to that crucial moment in June 1944, when thousands of aircraft were hastily painted to save them from friendly fire. The debate over who deserves credit for invasion stripes continued for years after the war, revealing the complexity of innovation in large military organizations. Several officers claimed to have suggested similar marking schemes before Lieutenant Colonel Smith's intervention, and some of these claims had merit. British sources pointed to earlier experiments with recognition stripes on training aircraft. American sources noted that transport units had discussed identification problems for months before D-Day. The historical consensus, reflected in official British and American military histories, gives Smith credit not for inventing the concept, but for pushing it to implementation at the critical moment when it was most needed. The cost-benefit analysis of invasion stripes remains one of the most favorable in military history. The entire program, including paint, labor, and administrative overhead, cost the Allied forces an estimated £25,000 sterling, equivalent to roughly £1.5 million in 2025 currency. That modest investment prevented aircraft losses that would have cost approximately £15 million to replace, not counting the irreplaceable human lives saved. This extraordinary return on investment made invasion stripes a case study in military logistics courses and operational planning seminars for generations of officers. The last operational aircraft bearing authentic World War II invasion stripes was likely a C-47 transport used by the French Air Force, which continued flying some American-built transports with their original markings into the early 1960s. By that point, the stripes had faded to barely visible shadows on the worn aluminum fuselage, but maintenance crews deliberately preserved them as a link to the aircraft's history. When that particular C-47 was finally retired and sent to a museum in 1964, 20 years after D-Day, it carried those stripes as a memorial to the desperate improvisation that had saved so many lives during history's largest amphibious invasion. The invasion stripes of June 1944 represent a peculiar category of military innovation, solutions that emerge from crisis rather than planning, that prioritize immediate effectiveness over elegance, and that succeed precisely because they bypass rather than work within established systems. The stripes were crude, hastily applied, and required no advanced technology or complex training. They worked because they addressed the fundamental problem. In the chaos of combat, soldiers needed a way to instantly distinguish friend from foe. 5 black and white stripes provided that certainty when nothing else could. Today, historians recognize the invasion stripes as emblematic of the Allied approach to World War II, willing to improvise, adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and prioritize practical results over procedural perfection. The stripes were not elegant or sophisticated, but they were effective. In 72 frantic hours, Allied forces painted their way out of a friendly fire crisis that threatened to undermine the entire Normandy invasion. That achievement, born from one officer's desperate observation and executed by thousands of exhausted ground crews working through the night, saved hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. The legacy of those hastily painted stripes extends far beyond World War II, reminding military planners and historians alike that sometimes the simplest solutions, implemented with speed and determination, prove more valuable than the most elaborate systems.